In the furthest reaches of inhabitable space, orbiting Jupiter, a space colony named Antillia, home to at least several countries' worth of people, is quietly descended upon by a raid of orbital frames. These building-sized robots are built for combat and utilize futuristic weaponry to battle and enact military operations. The invading force, Barham's mission, is to acquire or destroy 2 new orbital frames at any cost, even the colony they're infiltrating. Viola is introduced as the primary villain before we even see our protagonist. In a few lines, she reveals a grim attitude toward the whole affair, an almost wry mirth at the idea that they'll kill millions of innocent people. Despite the grim setting, or perhaps because of it, all she hopes to find is enjoyment. An Ender is a person born on the fringe of inhabitable space, and they aren't looked upon well. Leo and what we can assume are his friends were caught by whom we can only assume to be a natural-born Earthling on the colony. They're tied up for the crime of foraging for food. Whilst we're meant to be rooting for Antillia's salvation, the game doesn't present a very strong argument for it. Swiftly disregarding this brutal racism, or spacism I suppose, the rest of Leo's friends try to blame him for it. The Earthling frees only Leo and gives him a terrible conundrum. Run away, leaving the rats he calls friends to die, or punch this Earthling kid. This scene is here to establish Leo's key character flaws, his pacifism, his inaction, and most of all his cowardice. This is our protagonist. As the invasion erupts, this hostage situation was ultimately dissolved when Viola happens to down an Antillian Lev, and Leo simply stood there and watched while the relatively innocent lives of these children were crushed under the weight of a war machine. So now he runs away, averting his eyes from the bodies strewn about in the fallout, and weeps. Soon his hiding place too becomes a combat zone, as the situation spreads and he flees to a nearby building housing a state-of-the-art orbital frame. Circumstances have it that Leo somehow stumbles, accidentally exposes the cockpit and just happens to trip and slide right in there by mistake. The cockpit boots up, the giant robot is satisfyingly unshackled, just in time to defend itself from an enemy frame, for the player to defend themselves. Jehuty moves smoothly in entirely 3D space, and a lot of processes are automated like aiming and primary weapon choice. The enemy is using a long-range weapon not suited to the stage to really give the player some training wheels and demonstrate the destructible environment. The control scheme can't be called simple, but simplified. However, there is a natural and intuitive feel to having 3 axes of absolutely free 3D movement. The targeting system takes 2 broad, very appropriate inspirations. First of all is a kind of VirtualOn enemy-focused lock-on that's lockstep with the perspective of Jehuty. Denoted by a green cursor, this camera system is used at distance to allow the player to continuously press square to fire their long-range weapons, whilst focusing on their positioning and movement in the environment. Aiming isn't a concern outside of specific skill checks and sub-weapons. When approaching, the green cursor will turn red. This will engage close range mode. This shows some very clear similarities to Ocarina of Time. Jehuty will automatically switch to using melee weapons and grab on the targeted enemy, and the camera will change perspective, focusing on Jehuty from the enemy's perspective as Jehuty weightlessly orbits around the enemy frame. This allows the player a steady camera that can more easily reveal the interaction between blades, and allow for more cinematic depictions of the small flashes of melee that so commonly occur in the game. To tutorialize basic movement, they immediately direct the player to 2 goals of varying altitude. There was clearly great care taken in quickly establishing the controls for people who refuse to play typical tutorials. Lateral movement is controlled with the left stick, and triangle and X control altitude. The camera snaps behind Jehuty every time you release all directions, leaving the right analog stick fairly unused during the game, outside of very few manual aiming segments. There's an awkwardness to this, but the quality of this camera automation results in a different feel for tasks like reorientation and environmental scanning from most other games, at least once you've developed a taste for the nuances of the system. Zone of the Enders is a game made a generation after the mainstream advent of 3D graphics, when imagination still ran wild about what the future held for video games, before the ubiquity of the twin-stick control and camera style. This game's control scheme was a major experiment. The closest direct comparison would be Dragon Ball Budokai Tenkaichi series, but claiming this doesn't do Z.O.E. 1 justice. It's said they spent a year perfecting this camera, and it really shows. This control scheme is unlike almost any other. It was peculiar at the time, and it's fittingly only grown more alien since. Yet the responsiveness and the slick animation aided by the programming of the lock-on and camera AI makes everything look absolutely intentional, even when you're obviously making a stupid mistake, kind of like a child being helped pilot a state-of-the-art war machine by an unfeeling AI. The events of our intro finally convene into a single story. Leo accidentally hijacked target Bravo and is now piloting it in self-defense. Unable to secure Jehuty, this leaves Viola's mission to destroy it. In trying to escape from trouble, Leo's cowardice has led him to the very thing that will draw the most attacks towards him. The different movement necessary to fight Viola and other enemies is immediately apparent. I've tried to make the footage look slick because I really like this game and it deserves the best light. Your first encounter with Viola is going to be sloppy, and possibly include a few deaths, which come with a unique blues quote from the boss. Mid-fight, Viola realizes it's just a child piloting the robot, but that isn't enough to stop her. What is a direct command that she's to retreat from her superior, leaving Leo to collect his thoughts. He looks down, exhausted, to the lev that fell and crushed his friends right in front of him.
I can detect no sign of vital activity.
You mean that everyone is dead?
That is correct. Good work, sir.
Jehuty's cockpit contains a tactical battle AI that aids the pilot in their decision-making, providing cold, calculated, factual information on the events as they transpire and recommendations of play. Her recommendations actually get stronger or thought out if the player performs badly. Her cold cadence isn't suited to interacting with children, however. Some of my favourite moments are Leo and Ada's interactions where the mature voice of the situation isn't driving the plot at all. Leo's stolen her, and all Ada can do is express bewilderment when he introduces concepts outside of her calculations, like goodwill, preservation of people's homes, or having value in the enemy's life. And somewhere between those two non-functioning characters, a pitch-black comedy routine gets going, which I'm pretty certain isn't particularly intentional. It's not even a product of the abysmal dub the game received, it's just directed kind of terribly. Anyway, interrupting Ada's running commentary of an infant's mental decline, looking at the paste of his friends' corpses, we get patched through to somebody who can actually move the plot forward. It's great direction. Leo expects some normalcy, some semblance of authority to reprimand him, but instead he gets offered a job. Jehuty's designated pilot is assuredly dead, and Leo's proven himself at least capable of moving the robot. Negotiations start to fall apart, though, because Leo simply isn't mentally prepared for the responsibility of taking offensive action, in the worst case killing another human. It's a reasonable position for a child. So this woman tells Leo that if he doesn't cooperate, then everyone he knows and loves will die, which induces shell shock. This war is going so badly, they have to emotionally blackmail a traumatized child into piloting a super weapon. This is some rather lengthy dialogue to establish Leo's internal contradictions. He wishes to defend his home and his people in spite of everything, but can't bring himself to commit acts of violence. This limit has been pushed by the tight and horrifying corner he's run into, and where it's led to the deaths of his friends, yet he still draws the line at homicide. After all, there's an irony to preserving lives by taking others. Theoretically, all life is valuable. Jehuty's overarching role is on Mars, and Leo is the impromptu delivery driver, to the other side of the colony at least. The game's structure from here outside of boss fights takes cues from JRPGs, with enemy sprites on the overworld. There's a map screen, wandering squads, and a strong emphasis on story. How you navigate those areas is dictated by the goal structures that Z.O.E builds. Most often this is finding a particular squad with a password, whom upon defeat will give you access to a driver update for an extended weapons set. The tutorial gives you basic enemies, and the driver located and unlocked takes you to the map. And straight into the first proper boss fight. Before engagement, however, Leo looks over to where his father lives, burning in cinders. He really quite takes this on the chin, though he is distracted when he sees a cute girl he knows running toward a church to try and save children from this godless conflagration. You know what, that is Celvise's character summed up pretty neatly. Her introduction is twofold. Immediately, it's to give Leo an incentive to actively engage with the boss within his character role, and secondly, it draws emphasis in the player's mind to the rather detailed environment destruction of the colony. As you play even normally, Ada will consistently note when the colony is being damaged, and this boss fight is no different. In the back of the player's head, they'll be considering the consequences of evading enemy fire, and where they are on the map. What a brilliant choice that draws you into the scenario. This one cutscene to gameplay set piece flavors the entire experience by drawing the focus to reoccurring meaningless repeated lines that would otherwise become extraordinarily annoying. The SOS mission after this cements it as another detail of consideration. The most brilliant sleight of hand here is that the environmental destruction actually has no bearing on how the game turns out in almost any way other than during the SOS missions. It's an emulsifier so potent you don't even notice it. Just like how the music leads in from the preamble into the boss fight proper. The typical boss fights of Z.O.E follow a two-stage structure, progressed when the boss is at 50% damage. Boss fights are typically projectile-based affairs with vicious knockback and high damage. The player dashing in and out of fire, taking pot shots or risking the time to pause and do a more powerful attack. These are accessible through the hold or a tap of the R2 button. At rest, Jehuty glides every which way swiftly and steadily. Pressing R2 during movement creates a dash, in which Jehuty's vector will become a bit more stiff but with a lot more haste. Tapping R2 has a second of cooldown, but the initial dash has some faster speed to it, meaning that what's generally going to be happening is constant taps of the R2 button. From dash at long range, pressing square initiates an Itano Circus. It's flashy, but it's not the most useful attack on a stationary enemy. Ultimately, it doesn't see much utility other than as cheap shots during a panic. The attack itself has an unholy cooldown which will often get you clipped by whatever you were dashing to avoid. When at close range, this becomes an instant slash attack that creates huge knockback. This attack is very useful, and its movement can't be counteracted intentionally by the AI. This is a valid panic move and is very abusable. Underutilization of these two attacks is the sign of a good Zone of the Enders player. When stationary, the R2 button will put Jehuty into a kind of faux charging animation, in which it becomes immobile save for the lock-on orientation. At short range, pressing square will produce a burst slash, which produces massive damage and pushback. It's a risky move as the enemy will often take it as an opportunity to interrupt or preempt, but you can potentially cue it by interrupting your own combo. At range, Jehuty Genki dammers a large ball of energy to volley at the enemy. It's a very linear attack and harder AI can dodge it consistently, but for boss fights and larger mechs, there's often clearly presented opportunities. It's for this reason the boss fights are something of a very basic 3D bullet hell. Still incredibly hard to the uninitiated, but this mode of play where the boss creates the pace never quite reaches the heights it should do. Nevertheless, they're consistently challenging and interesting, especially with the weight of the story behind them. The action always looks stylish and the visuals always look incredibly scenic. You can see the beautiful nighttime cityscape in the background, while the mid-ground stage is darkened in pitch-black fog, only letting the strongest lights pierce it. It frames this weird, squid-like, stem-headed monster pelting you with bright yellow projectiles. When it launches into the air, you can see the colony folding inward on itself through the protective shielding. This was a launch title, and its sense of visual direction is incredible. There's neon, darkness, and sharp artificial lighting in between. After the mech has fallen, Leo and Ada will fail to philosophize on the value of a human life that takes other human lives. Neither of them make their point well, because Ada is goal-oriented and Leo is feeling-oriented. After all, one's a child, the other's a computer. He still refuses to take human life. Rescuing Celvise, Leo tells her that she needs to at least care for herself. Supporting this kind of self-interest is a sign that he's excusing his actions up until now, despite everything. He seems to be coping. Celvise joins Leo and jacks the cockpit with him, which is surprising. I didn't feel they knew each other that well. They don't give the impression they're especially close, but that betrays their portrayal from here on. Her portrayal as unwaveringly valiant despite her lack of ability is a sharp contrast to Leo's actions in the introduction, and she provides a good counterbalance to Ada. She's an active pacifist, rather than an inactive one. Leo, as the protagonist, has conflicted feelings extrapolated to the world he inhabits like any Japanese protagonist in a mature horror-themed game. The crux of his character flaws are represented rather unevenly. Celvise plays the angel on Leo's shoulder, pointing out the morally good options and wanting to help. Ada plays the devil's advocate as a self-interested survivalist, which is a deeply layered irony. Through the game, Ada encourages Leo as an inexperienced pilot not to engage in battle, despite the enemies constantly firing stray shots at surrounding buildings, leading Ada to comment on it. Then again, if you're not careful, you do more damage than good. Furthermore, there's a slow RPG leveling system in which Jehuty will grow in experience, which encourages the player to fight as often as possible, if not just to watch the number go up. The story is consistently telling the player how this world is going to shit, with radio newscasters still somehow operating amidst the ongoing cataclysm. You're the only thing that can rescue it. The game has an end goal that can be reached within a rather wide window of actions, but the journey there is pulling the player in several contrasting ways between the narrative and the gameplay, and neither seems to take precedent. It all feels exceptionally carefully yet carelessly crafted to give the player the sense that they are indeed role-playing Leo's basic character predicament. Those SOS missions in particular are very difficult. There's a lot of information you won't be privy to, and time is of the essence with the enemy's passive environment destruction. If so much as one building that holds civilians is gone, you get a C rank, and Leo damns himself for his inability. Enemy and player fire can damage housing, including sub-weapons unlocked. These weapons are utilized with the circle button, selected with a Metal Gear-esque menu that pauses the game, or simply using the D-pad's up-down, which keeps the game's momentum going. First unlocked is Javelin, which the enemy also uses and gives them excuse to drop ammunition for it. They have a downward trajectory, which means they're going to miss and hit the floor very, very often. When player positioning plays this much of an emphasis, and when stray gunshots can obliterate human life, there is never a chance to relax. These SOS missions are often cited as the least fun parts of Zone of the Enders 1. And admittedly, yes, they are the least fun parts of Zone of the Enders 1. A typical argument back says they're mostly optional, but that's untrue. You can achieve a bad ending just before the final act of the game if you choose to leave all of them, especially the last SOS mission. They're stressful, unforgiving, panicked, unfair, and overall a mess. They take a very expressive combat engine and start to enforce restrictions lest you risk mistakes. Most of all, they're a very vicious difficulty spike. Indeed, the assessment that they're unfun is correct. But would it be appropriate for them to be fun? Would the game be better off without SOS missions? For one, I'm not of the opinion that difficulty spikes are of themselves a bad thing. A smooth difficulty curve has no texture or interest. The careful curation it takes leaves everything feeling artificial. Spikes in difficulty where excessive can dissociate the player from their role, but this experience is unique to how the player themselves reacts to stress in games. The job of the player is to play their role on the stage. The stage could be a boss fight, the stage could be an SOS mission, but the terminology of programming in video games is mostly recycled from stage plays. Oftentimes, a player will break their assigned character when the game stops being fair or becomes too easy. And they'll break their immersion, even when that spike or ditch is intentional. There's a limit to how much you can push the boundaries of good taste when you allow a narrative to negatively bleed into the game's design. These SOS missions for some are simply bad parts of the game. The question of why arises, but they don't want an answer. That's a fault of both the game and the player. The SOS missions are here because they truly enforce the role of Leo and every emotion he might be feeling. The incredible power of Jehuty being used for pedestrian tasks like rescuing people. It's like using a tank to put out a fire. Jehuty in every aspect of its design is meant to destroy, both canonically and in its interaction with the world, and this world is not designed to be a battlefield. These are homes, apartment buildings, cities. Until very late on, the game never reaches its full potential as an action game because of the setting and context. The game leans heavily into horror. The music has an edgy industrial techno vibe with constant unease. Even if you can avoid the end of the world, Leo's a cowardly child. His home and nearly everyone he cares for are practically dead. He's not mature enough to responsibly handle the power in his hands, and that power is so great that any mistake brings an end to the world closer. It's a unique example of a horror game, where the unease comes from the fact that you're too powerful. The urban environments constantly provide a sense of scale for the battles happening and how little they fit into this world. This contrast is fully intentional, and a far more direct and effective anti-war message than its contemporaries, even from the same company. Zone of the Enders would be more than an interesting failure. The story, honestly, is excellent, and the achievements towards its themes are impeccable, but the narrative cutscenes range from well-directed to unintentionally funny to truly awful, and this marks the point in which the game stumbles into two back-to-back backtracking missions, which see you revisit the same area twice to get to two different progress unlocking items, without any meaningful story content to speak of. It's not as if there's not story that could have filled the time, and the antagonist, Viola, is absent for the entire second act of the game. Zone of the Enders was an early attempt to create a multimedia franchise under the example of Pokemon. Alongside the release of this game, an original video animation from Sunrise was written and animated. 5 years prior to the events of Zone of the Enders, Mars. Treated as a colony of Earth, it's subject to United Nations inspections and extreme unjust scrutiny. Civil unrest is present in Martian culture, and there's even some violent prejudice against Martians from visiting Earthlings as they take advantage of their poor environment. The comparative gravity and artificial atmosphere leaves humans raised on Mars meek. Their bodies are placed under less daily stress, and everyday items are going to hold nothing of the same weight. You would imagine that there's something humanity could do about this, like simply lifting larger weights, but there's only so much you can do about things like human development in such conditions. It either shows that such precautions haven't been taken for Mars, or their military is treated as a joke by Earth. One such Martian, Radam, is proving himself a capable pilot for Barum, then Mars' self-defense force. Although, yes, pure physical power not necessarily being the most important thing when you drive a mech, as a branch of Earth's military, the Martian soldiers are given beatings and seen as lower beings. There's only one scene of this abuse of status and power, but characters interact in a manner that suggests this is a regular occurrence. The United Nations Space Force act with confidence, and Radam acts with rash emotion. It's almost treated as routine by everyone if not for it happening to them. This time it almost escalates to the point where Radam reaches for his firearm, left with no other means of defense against an Earthling's simple punches. Although events stop him short, it's a somewhat defining moment for Radam's character, where he tries to do what's right, but will act in desperation and use any means necessary when backed into a corner. It's a dangerous character trait, even if he's not necessarily in the wrong. This original video animation came out alongside Zone of the Enders in Japan, and can therefore be considered something of a comorbidity in this autopsy. It bears mentioning because in this prequel, it tells of the origin of Viola, orbital frames, and expands the mystique of Metatron, a mysterious power source that distinguishes orbital frames from typical levs. As an immediate secondary character, Viola plays a far more mundane and rational role despite being the villain of the video game counterpart. Her character traits are reintroduced immediately, that she has something of a death wish, but is trying to at least find some utility in a death, if not a life. As a child, Earth terrorists tore a blackout screen that insulates Martian civilization from the full radiation of the sun, as they don't seem to have a native ozone. Viola was among the civilians severely affected. Her family seems to have died in the incident. She's diagnosed with space radiation sickness, which still has perceptible symptoms after 13 years. The movie doesn't waste time asking about potential arthritis, blood poisoning, or how expensive Viola's wigs must be, but something that may actually weigh on her character is the very real risk of infertility. It's something that's hard to come to terms with as a human. The instinct to reproduce may be pathetic at times, but it's among the only things optimistic in nature. We think of life as a gift. It's said that every girl's dream is to one day have a full and happy family. If you cannot create new life, it's understandable that one would develop a complex around this, in combination with the death of the rest of their family. Viola has no remaining connections in this world, and she'll never be able to create them. Her life of squalor and looking for a place to die leads her to an altercation with Radam. Her expression of hatred for all Earth-related military leads him to introduce her to Baram. In the present day, Viola is expressing quite an obvious romantic interest in our protagonist, between wanting to protect and be near him at all times. Unfortunately for her, his girlfriend Dolores happens to be a high-ranking scientist, and they're in an actually fertile relationship. In fact, through what's likely nepotism, Radam and Viola are transferred to a secret project as test pilots for Idolo, the first orbital frame. The story of how Baram went from Mars Defense Force to anti-terrestrial terrorists isn't elaborated upon directly, but we get a window into their increasingly radical acts as an organization. Baram is going behind the UN's back, creating weapons, and are testing Idolo in blind spots of the satellite surveillance. It's seemingly the first time Metatron itself has been used in any weapon, and the power source is untested. It doesn't seem to handle or output like traditional energy sources at all. The movie likens it to a kind of magic, and Radam as a kind of magician. The animation on Idolo's biomechanics is somewhat disgusting and grotesque. It holds the same form as perhaps a typical orbital frame we see in-game, but it shatters where it outlets energy, and deforms in animation in ways that vehicle and characters really don't. The story derails at the start of the second act, when Radam starts to develop some kind of mythical connection to Idolo. This is a story written after Evangelion. The deconstruction of the mech as an extended embodiment of the pilot like a samurai with a sword is a readily deconstructed concept. Idolo appears to have a will of its own, and a monogamous symbiotic relationship with its pilot. It rejects Viola's commands. I'm not entirely certain how you deliver commands within a cockpit like that. I can't see a DualShock 2 anywhere in there. It's traditionally a taboo to ask how the control panels of a mech actually control something so complex as the human form in such a simple configuration. But it seems like some aspects of Idolo's Metatron will synchronize with the pilot and work to adopt their will. When you combine Idolo's seeming will of its own with its ability to interface with human consciousness, the horrors that are to unfold are illuminated. Radam exhibits changes of character as his symbiotic relationship to Idolo builds into an unhealthy obsession. There's an iconic scene where he catches a snake and crushes its throat with his bare hand, before hallucinating that he, himself, is indeed the mech. During a training exercise he becomes crazed, enjoying every moment he's in the robot. True to his character, he's falling back on a weapon, a borrowed power, to compensate for his own inability. The UN Space Force inspectors at the beginning are caught spying, and Radam makes short work of them, leaving only one which he can lay sweet revenge into. At this point, Radam's goodwill and ideals have fallen away, whether it's a lapse in sanity from some kind of Metatron poisoning, or if the Metatron itself holds consciousness-altering properties, it's uncertain. The point where Dolores and Radam's relationship really develops believability is where, noticing the changes in his personality, she asks him to confide in her, and Radam very frankly opens up to her. He's mistaking Idolo's strengths as his own, and in the face of power that grand, his mundane ideals of Martian independence weren't so strong to begin with. He's struggling to convene the simplicity of himself as a man with the inconceivable amount of power he's adopted. For all of his faults, he's at the very least realized the responsibility he holds is immeasurable, and it's brought to the forefront his character flaws as a bitter and hateful man out for revenge. It's a rather beautiful and honest scene for the couple. In the next scene, he immediately tells Viola that he's leaving the army which he inducted her into and that he's going to marry Dolores. The female doctor is part of a subplot setting up Zone of the Enders, the animated series, which I really don't have much love for. Terrible opening too. She can't in good conscience continue the project after seeing what it's been doing to Radham, so it at least builds upon a running theme of Metatron being an unstable and uncertain energy source, outright drawing nuclear power as a comparison. This is a post-World War II Japanese IP from Konami Computer Entertainment Japan, which would later be known as Kojima Productions. The game was produced by Hideo Kojima and directed by Noriaki Okamura, who would go on to produce most of the notable Metal Gear spin-offs. To simply say Metatron holds parallels to nuclear power isn't too elucidating. Nuclear power is scary and unpredictable and has brought immeasurable destruction to the world. It's a weapon so powerful they're now reserved for the end of the world. Metatron isn't treated as such to make a point. When you concentrate that amount of power into an idol, a representation of a human figure, you can draw meaning from that, especially from Radham's comments where he'd mistaken Idolo's power as his own. It's something of a commentary on the Western mythology around weapons. As an Englishman, it's been my observation that you give an American a gun, and they think they have the power of God in their hands. Responsibility and weight seems an afterthought. Perhaps the best distinction I can make is that the Japanese believe the sword is an extension of their will, and the Americans believe the gun is an enabler of their will. Perhaps it's simply a difference between an ancient and a new country. Perhaps the criticism lies between the incompatibility of these two philosophies. Conveniently enough, a terrestrial raid begins at the Barham facility. Hilariously, they kidnap an enemy prisoner and kill their friendly prisoner. But this is set up to the culmination of tension and the denouement. On their way through the facility, Dolores is kidnapped as well, being a head scientist. Having defended Idolo from the Earthlings, Viola informs Radham of Dolores' capture. It's enough that he doesn't think twice about getting into Idolo's cockpit to rescue her. Viola starts trying to threaten Radham with the consequences of his actions. First, that he'd be committing a felony, and that it would have legal ramifications. Secondly, that she'd have to come after him too, as a soldier chasing a military felon. And thirdly, that he'd said he'd fight for Mars no matter what. Finally, after nothing else has worked, she says that Radham is all that she has left. No family, no friends, nothing else. You can imagine the pain she feels having him choose Dolores over herself, but that's how things have come to be. Radham tells Viola that he's finally found a purpose for the immense power that he has piloting Idolo. He finally has an ideal strong enough to allow him to control the power he holds, protecting the woman that he loves, even if that makes him an enemy of Earth and Mars, being hunted down by both sides, and even his friends. But they need some good fucking luck taking down the greatest weapon humanity has ever known before he gets to his target though. The thrilling conclusion contains a lot of great action scenes and takes a lot of inspiration from the game's animations. It's fantastic even if the budget leaves a little to be desired. The name Radham holds two meanings, in that it's transliterated occasionally as radium, like the highly radioactive metal, and seems to rhyme with Adam, basically the first man. Idolo may be a play on the concept of an idol, perhaps a false one. Dolores is a biblical name too, derived from the Latin word for sorrow or misery, all of which are incredibly appropriate. Viola is a more complicated case though. Hers refers to a stringed instrument, the name derived from violet. Ultraviolet light is a radiation with too high a frequency to be visible to the human eye, on the precipice of being X-ray radiation. The instrument's name is also said to be derived from the Greek vitulari, meaning to cry out or rejoice. Radham finds his girlfriend and the doctor in the middle of a one-sided confrontation where the Doctor's stubborn ideals and Dolores' goodwill ends up in the fatal shooting of Radham's target of affection and protection. They share a final moment, her final words being everything that Radham wants to hear, but in a situation that Radham never wanted to be in. This begs a question. It's all well and good if a man has his ultimate ideal that will let him wield ultimate power for good, but ultimate power doesn't determine reality. Radham has the most powerful weapon in existence and he still couldn't save the woman that he loved. What happens when you fail your ideal? If the ultimate ideal is to hedge the meaning of our existence on our love for other people, the limitation of that philosophy is the very same human limitations we were fighting all the way through the movie. To be human is to be limited and fickle. That includes our lifespan. Dolores is just a woman. Was just a woman. Her death isn't a grand event. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It could almost be described as an accident. And Radham is just a man. He realized the scope of his personality and realized that he couldn't wield such immense power until he had something worthwhile to use it for. And now all that's left is that power. Nothing else. Her body has a subtle reaction with the cockpit, and somewhere between a lapse of sanity and the Metatron's reaction, he begins to hallucinate the wedding he'll never have, while Daedalo goes on a self-defensive ballet rampage. The line between Radham's and the Metatron's will is faltering. The sounds of clapping from an empty audience blend out to the sounds of gunshots clattering. The illusion is momentarily lapsed by Viola's clear statement of fact. There's only one person in the cockpit. There's no wedding. But Radham seemingly chooses to live within the fantasy, even if it means suicide by military force. I suppose at least in this universe there's some merit to power being a suitable alternative to true happiness. This brutal, sad, and kind of beautiful ending forces many questions. Rather than a statement of clear fact that nuclear power is evil, it asks the rhetorical question of whether or not mankind is ready and capable of wielding power multiple times greater than itself, whether we can take responsibility of the potential mass destruction, and if we're consistently morally aligned enough to actually maintain control over that power, or if we're so weak that the power will indeed take us over in a lapse of judgment. Having experienced all of that, having nothing left to live for, and having seen Radham happiest when completely lost in the power of Metatron, where does that leave Viola?